Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a little different, maybe unexpected. We're taking a character from a pretty famous action movie.
A very famous action movie.
Yeah.
Michael Bay, explosions, Alcatraz.
Exactly. General Francis X. Hummel from 1996's The Rock. But we're not just talking about the movie plot. We're looking at him through a really serious academic lens.
Yeah, that's the core of it today. We're diving into a scholarly paper, believe it or not, that analyzes Hummel like he's a real historical figure or maybe a clinical case study.
Okay, so lay it out for us. What's the source?
The paper is titled The Case of General Francis X. Hummel, a Psychological and Ethical Reappraisal. It's by a scientific analyst, Justin Lake, who's affiliated with this group called the Independent Researcher, Strategic Ethics and Narrative Analysis Division. This came out in October 2020.
Independent researcher, strategic ethics. Wow, okay, so they're applying serious frameworks to a fictional character. That's unusual.
It is, but Lake's approach is rigorous. He's not just, writing fan fiction analysis. He's using established psychological and ethical models.
And Hummel, just to remind everyone, he's the decorated Marine general who steals VX gas rockets, takes over Alcatraz.
Right, and threatens San Francisco, the demand.
Right.
$100 million. But not for himself.
No, that's key. It was for the families of covert operatives killed on secret missions, men the government refused to acknowledge, let alone compensate.
That's the crux of it. On the surface, it looks like straightforward treason, holding a city hostage. But Lake's paper turns that completely on its head.
How so? What's the big reversal here?
Lake's central argument, the really provocative thesis, is that Hummel's actions weren't treason in the way we usually think about it. He argues it was actually something he calls ethical insurgency.
Ethical insurgency. Okay, unpack that a bit.
It means Lake sees Hummel's rebellion not as a personal failing or a sudden snap, but as a direct result of profound institutional betrayal by the very system he served. And a resulting condition called moral injury.
So the system failed him first.
That's the argument. Lake suggests the rot within the institution, the refusal to honor its soldiers, pushed Hummel into this extreme corner. His loyalty, paradoxically, transformed into defiance because the institution itself had become disloyal to its own values.
Okay, so our mission today then is to really trace that argument. Follow Lake's analysis of how this decorated general, this patriot, could end up threatening his own country. We need to understand that psychological journey.
Exactly. And it's not just about understanding a movie character better. Lake uses these concepts, moral injury, betrayal trauma theory, that are, frankly, incredibly relevant today.
How so? What's the benefit for, someone listening?
Well, understanding how these forces work in Hummel gives you a powerful lens for looking at real-world situations. Think about whistleblowers, for example, or soldiers grappling with orders they find morally questionable.
Right. People caught between following the rules and following their conscience.
Precisely. Lake's analysis of Hummel basically provides a framework for understanding what happens when loyalty to an institution clashes violently with loyalty to, well, truth or justice. It helps explain how systemic neglect can breed extreme responses.
Okay, let's start where Lake starts then, with the betrayal itself. Section 1 in his paper really sets the context, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Before you can understand the reaction, you have to understand the initial wound.
And Lake makes it really clear, Hummel wasn't some outsider. He wasn't disgruntled from the start.
No, quite the opposite. This is crucial. He was a major general in the U.S. Marine Corps, highly decorated, Silver Star, Navy Cross. The film even gives him a Medal of Honor, though fictional. He was embedded deep within the system, respected, admired.
So not a rogue agent archetype. He was the establishment, in a way.
Absolutely. And Lake argues that's exactly why his turn is so significant. When someone at that level, with that much invested, with that much honor, presumably, breaks ranks so spectacularly, it points fingers back at the system.
It suggests the problem isn't just one guy losing it.
Right. It implies a systemic failure. If the institution can betray its very best, its most loyal, then something is deeply wrong within the institution itself. Hummel's status makes the indictment that much stronger. The rot, Lake implies, reached the highest levels.
And the specific trigger wasn't some abstract political disagreement. It was deeply personal, tied to his command.
Yes, the catalyst was the government's flat-out refusal, a cold, bureaucratic stonewalling when it came to acknowledging or compensating the families of his men killed on these deniable offs.
Men he likely sent on those missions.
Exactly. He felt responsible. Lake describes the government stance as silence and erasure. Think about that from Hummel's perspective. He promised these men, their families, that their sacrifice mattered, that their country would honor them.
And then the country basically pretends they never existed.
Worse than pretends, actively covers it up, treats their deaths as inconvenient secrets, maybe liabilities. For a commander like Hummel, who lives by a code of honor and loyalty to his men, that's not just policy. It's a fundamental moral betrayal, a breach of the sacred trust between soldier, commander, and country.
So that puts him in an impossible position,
Yeah?
this moral dissonance Lake talks about.
Yes, a profound dissonance. He's caught. On one side, you have the absolute bedrock of military life. Obey orders, respect the chain of command, follow the legal structure.
And the other.
His duty to his men, his sense of justice, his own conscience telling him that abandoning the fallen and their families is fundamentally wrong. It violates the very code the military supposedly stands for.
He has to choose between legal obedience and moral fidelity.
And Lake argues this isn't just a tough ethical choice, it's what he calls institutional hypocrisy, made manifest. The institution preaches honor, sacrifice, leave no man behind, but then practices cold, pragmatic abandonment when it's convenient.
We see in the film he tried the proper channels first, right? Letters, appeals.
Yes, Lake notes that. He exhausted the internal remedies. He wrote letters, appealed up the chain, navigated the bureaucracy, and he was met with silence, obstruction, maybe even threats. He hit a dead end.
The point where legal duty and moral duty just couldn't coexist anymore.
That's what Lake calls the existential conflict.
Yeah.
It's not just about policy. It challenges his very identity. Who is he? A good Marine follows orders, but a good man, a good leader, doesn't abandon his people.
If the law demands complicity in what he sees as a profound injustice,
Then the law, in his eyes, loses its moral authority. He's forced to decide which code matters more, the written regulations of the state or the unwritten code of honor he believes in.
so his fight wasn't really against America, but against what he saw as a betrayal within America, a corruption of its ideals.
That's the core of Lake's thesis right there. His conclusion for this section is really powerful. He says Hummel's revolt should be seen as a symptom of systemic decay, not individual pathology.
He wasn't the disease, he was the fever showing the infection.
A really good way to put it. He wasn't a broken cog. He was a high-precision instrument that broke because the machine itself was malfunctioning so badly. His integrity, the very thing he was honored for, became the engine of his rebellion.
Okay, so the system creates the conditions. Let's move into section 2, where Lake applies psychological frameworks. How did this systemic failure translate into Hummel's individual psyche?
Right, Lake shifts from the institutional context to the personal impact. He essentially frames Hummel's journey as a textbook case, almost, for severe psychological distress, using specific clinical models.
And the first big one is moral injury.
Yes, moral injury. It's crucial to understand this isn't the same as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. People often confuse them.
What's the key difference?
Well, PTSD is typically linked to fear, to experiencing or witnessing life-threatening events. It's a trauma response rooted in danger and horror. Moral injury, though, then it's different. It's a wound to your conscience, to your core ethical beliefs.
So it's about violating your own moral code, or seeing it violated.
Exactly. It can happen from doing something that transgresses your deeply held beliefs, or from witnessing others do so. Or, and this is key for Hummel, from being betrayed by leaders or institutions who violate that moral code. It's about the ethical dimension of trauma.
And Hummel's trauma wasn't the battlefield itself, but what happened after. The betrayal by the state.
Precisely. Lake argues Hummel displays classic symptoms of moral injury. Let's break those down.
Okay.
First, there's intense guilt and shame, guilt over failing his men. He made promises, implicit or explicit. He felt responsible for their welfare even after death. The government's silence made him feel complicit in their abandonment.
That makes sense. What else?
Second, profound anger and alienation. This isn't just annoyance at bureaucracy. It's a deep, simmering rage directed at the institution he feels has betrayed him and everything he stood for. He feels alienated from the very system he dedicated his life to. It feels corrupt, unjust.
And that leads to the action.
It leads to the third symptom, which Lake sees as the driving force. A desperate need for moral repair. He can't just get over it. The moral wound is too deep. It demands action to try and set things right.
So the Alcatraz plot, that wasn't just revenge. It was an attempt to fix something.
Lake argues yes. It's a radical, destructive attempt at reconstruction. He's trying to force the system to acknowledge the truth, to pay the debt, to restore the honor of the fallen. By doing so, he's trying to repair the moral breach, both externally and within himself. For Lake, Hummel's extreme actions are a manifestation of this overwhelming need for moral repair. Psychological relief, in this view, could only come from forcing accountability.
That's a powerful reframing, but Lake doesn't stop there. He adds another layer, betrayal trauma theory.
Right. This concept, developed by Jennifer Freyd, is particularly relevant when we talk about institutions.
How does it differ from moral injury, or how does it compound it?
Betrayal trauma specifically addresses the trauma that occurs when the entity you depend on for survival, safety, or identity betrays you. The classic example is a child betrayed by a caregiver, but it applies powerfully to institutional settings too.
And the military is arguably the ultimate high-reliance institution. You entrust your life, your future, everything to the command structure, to the government behind it.
Absolutely, the dependence is total. So when that institution, that ultimate authority, betrays you, the trauma is catastrophic. It's not just disappointment, it's a fundamental shattering of your world.
And in Hummel's case, the betrayal wasn't just neglect. Lake points out it was active concealment.
Yes, the government didn't just forget these men, it actively erased them, forced Hummel and others into silence. That active concealment, protecting the institution's image over the truth and the lies of its soldiers, that's high-stakes betrayal.
So Lake argues this betrayal is the catalyst. It's what flips the switch from loyal general to something else.
It shatters his cognitive map, his understanding of the world. He goes from being a patriot validated by the system to someone whose very existence is now defined by the system's lies. The betrayal trauma explains the intensity of his reaction, why it wasn't just disillusionment, but a full-blown crisis demanding radical action.
So putting moral injury and betrayal trauma together, that explains the why this specific general took this specific extreme path.
Exactly. It connects the deep internal wound, the moral injury, the sense of betrayal to the external dramatic action. The psychological pain is so immense, the violation of trust so complete, that Lake argues only an equally extreme action felt like it could possibly restore balance or force the necessary reckoning.
The extremity of the action reflects the extremity of the betrayal.
That's Lake's argument. Hummel's takeover of Alcatraz wasn't random madness. It was, in this psychological framework, a desperate, almost logical, if terrifying response from a man whose moral compass had been shattered by the institution he served. It was a screen made manifest.
Which leads us directly into Lake's most original contribution in Section 3, this idea of ethical insurgency.
Yes, this is where Lake synthesizes the context and the psychology into his own model. It's really the core of the paper's argument for reevaluating Hummel.
So what defines ethical insurgency as opposed to just insurgency or terrorism?
The key difference, according to Lake, lies in the motive. Standard insurgents, or terrorists, usually seek political power, territory, money, or to impose a new ideology through violence and fear. Ethical insurgency, as Lake defines it, is different. It's an act of rebellion driven not by self-interest or political ambition, but by a perceived moral imperative to confront systemic wrongdoing within the existing structure, especially after all legitimate channels have failed.
So Hummel isn't trying to overthrow the government. He's trying to force it to live up to its own stated values.
Precisely. His demands are purely ethical and remedial. Acknowledge the men, compensate the families. He wants to restore the moral order, not destroy the system.
But he uses the threat of mass destruction, the VX gas, to do it. That's the sticking point, surely.
It is. And Lake absolutely acknowledges that the method is abhorrent and criminal. But he insists we have to separate method from motive and ultimate intent if we want to understand the psychology. The VX gas, in Lake's view, functions as an ethical ultimatum, recognition or reckoning.
He's using the most horrific leverage imaginable to force a moral concession the system refused to make willingly.
He's essentially weaponizing the state's own moral failure against it. The threat itself becomes a commentary on how deaf the system was to conventional appeals. Lake argues it's a catastrophic tool, chosen because Hummel believed only something that extreme could pierce the bureaucratic indifference.
But doesn't using WMDs as leverage automatically make you a terrorist, regardless of the why? Is Lake just creating a sophisticated excuse here?
That's the critical challenge, and Lake tackles it directly. He argues that intent matters crucially. A terrorist typically intends mass casualties to create fear and destabilize. Hummel, Lake argues, intends to use the threat of casualties to force a moral outcome. His goal isn't destruction, it's correction. It's a fine line, maybe an impossible one, but Lake insists the distinction is vital for understanding this specific case.
And to support that distinction, Lake delves into Hummel's specific profile.
Yes, in sections 4.1 and 4.2 of the paper, he builds a psychological and ethical profile to argue that Hummel fits the ethical insurgent model, not the standard villain or terrorist model.
What aspects of the profile does he highlight? You mentioned his rank and honors earlier.
Yes, that's key. Major general, decorated war hero. Lake emphasizes this because a man with that much status, that much invested in the system, has everything to lose. His reputation, his freedom, his life.
He's not some disenfranchised nobody with nothing left to lose.
Exactly. The fact that he risks it all and explicitly rejects personal gain. Remember, he scoffs at the idea of ransom for himself, strengthens Lake's argument that the motivation had to be overwhelmingly ideological, a pure moral imperative.
And the stressors Lake identifies the institutional neglect, the bureaucratic stonewalling.
They all feed directly into the psychological diagnoses we discussed. Moral injury, betrayal, trauma. They create that unbearable cognitive dissonance between the code he lived by and the reality he was forced to confront.
Which brings us to Lake's actual hypothetical diagnosis for Hummel. What does he put down?
It's quite specific. He lists moral injury, type 2, suggesting institutional betrayal, chronic betrayal trauma, and then this really striking phrase, ideological possession under ethical justification.
Ideological possession under ethical justification. What exactly does Lake mean by that? It sounds quite extreme.
It implies that Hummel became so consumed by his sense of justice, by his idealized vision of what the Marines and the country should stand for, that this ideology effectively took control. It overrode his rational legal self.
So his ethical certainty became absolute.
Yes. The ethical justification honoring his men became so paramount in his mind that it possessed him, giving him, in his view, the moral authority to break any law, any norm that stood in the way. He's no longer acting just as a general bound by rules, but as a crusader driven by a higher, albeit internal code.
That's a complex, maybe dangerous state of mind.
Undoubtedly. But Lake supports this profile with behavioral indicators. He points out Hummel's high internal moral consistency, how he treats his own men on Alcatraz, maintaining discipline, demanding loyalty, and crucially, his resistance to corrupt incentives.
Like turning down the quick payoff the FBI offers.
Exactly. A typical greedy villain would take the money. Hummel dismisses it. He says the money is meaningless without the government acknowledging the truth, honoring the men. That reinforces the idea that his goal is fundamentally ethical, not material.
Okay, but perhaps the most critical piece of evidence for Lake, the thing that really separates Hummel in his analysis, is the non-lethal intent.
This is absolutely central to the ethical insurgency model. Lake stresses Hummel's profound reluctance to deploy VX gas. We see it in the film. He argues, he hesitates. The threat is the weapon, but actually using it is a line he desperately wants to avoid crossing.
He intends to coerce, not annihilate.
That's Lake's argument. The plan is a form of extreme moral theater designed to shock the system into compliance. The fact that he doesn't have the cold-blooded intent to kill civilians is what, for Lake, distinguishes him fundamentally from a terrorist or a simple madman. His ultimate aim is justice, however distorted the path he took to get there.
He built the bomb, but he couldn't bring himself to light the fuse when it came down to it.
A perfect way to put it. And that internal conflict, that reluctance, leads us straight into the core paradox of his entire plan, which Lake tackles in the next section.
Right, section 4. This gets into the really deep ethical weeds, the paradox. Using monstrous means to achieve a righteous end.
It's the heart of the tragedy, isn't it? Threatening mass murder to compel moral act recognition and compensation, it's inherently contradictory.
He has to become the monster, temporarily, to fight what he sees as monstrous behavior by the state.
Lake argues this paradox itself reveals the depth of Hummel's conviction. He chose the most extreme means imaginable because he genuinely believed that only that level of horrific leverage could possibly shake the system out of its moral apathy. The extremity of the means reflects his perception of the extremity of the initial betrayal.
But the key thing, as you mentioned, is that he doesn't follow through. He pulls back at the last moment.
Yes, and Lake finds this incredibly significant. He calls Hummel's final refusal to allow the launch ethical containment.
Ethical containment, meaning he managed to hold on to some moral boundary even at the brink?
Exactly. Lake suggests that once someone initiates an action of this magnitude, involving weapons of mass destruction, the psychological momentum, the commitment, the group dynamics, they almost always push the actor across the final line. It's incredibly rare, Lake implies, for someone to pull back at that point.
They get swept up in the escalation they started.
Right. But Hummel resists that. He contains the horror he unleashed, even though it means failing his mission as he defined it, and ultimately leads to his death. He prevents the atrocity.
So his death isn't just the villain getting his comeuppance.
Not according to Lake. He explicitly states Hummel's end is not villainy''s conclusion, but tragedy's completion. He dies trying to stop his own men from committing mass murder. He dies, essentially, protecting the very civilians he threatened.
He sacrifices himself to uphold the last shred of the moral code he was fighting for.
It highlights the paradox of the moral soldier that Lake discusses. For Hummel, at that final moment, obedience to his own radical plan would have meant becoming the very thing he hated, someone who sacrifices innocent lives for a cause. His final act of defiance is against his own destructive capability. It becomes, ironically, his last act of loyalty to a fundamental human ethic.
But the system can't see it that way, can it? The government has to paint him as a simple traitor. Which brings us to Lake's point about systemic scapegoating.
Yes, Section 5.2. This is critical. The moment Hummel acts, the institution's defense mechanisms kick in. He must be framed as a rogue element, a madman, a traitor.
Why is that framing so necessary for the system?
Because it performs a vital psychological function. It externalizes the guilt. If Hummel is just one bad apple who went crazy, then the barrel, the military, the government, the bureaucracy remains fundamentally good and sound.
It allows the system to avoid looking at its own role in creating the crisis.
Precisely. It's far easier politically and psychologically to condemn the dissenter than to admit that systemic failure, systemic neglect, systemic betrayal pushed one of its own to such extremes. Lake argues this is done to protect its own moral illusion.
The illusion that the government always honors its soldiers, that the system is just.
Exactly. Maintaining that illusion is crucial for public trust, for military morale, for the continued functioning of the state. So the narrative becomes, Hummel was the problem, and eliminating him solved it. Lake suggests The Rock, the film itself, can be read as a study in how powerful institutions manipulate narratives and invert moral truth to ensure their own survival. The one demanding moral accountability becomes the villain.
And Lake connects this directly to real-world situations. This isn't just about interpreting a movie.
No, he makes a clear link in 5.3. He argues that modern whistleblowers, people who leak documents or expose wrongdoing from within powerful organizations, often citing moral reasons, frequently face the same pattern.
They get labeled as traitors, disgruntled employees, narcissists.
Anything other than what they might actually be.
Yeah.
Individuals driven by conscience to expose uncomfortable truths about the system. The system attacks the messenger to avoid dealing with the message. It's a form of moral inversion.
So the Hummel archetype, as analyzed by Lake, becomes a model for understanding that dynamic.
Yes. It shows how, in certain dysfunctional systems, integrity itself, loyalty to a moral code, rather than just to bureaucratic rules, can become perceived as a threat. It can effectively become criminalized.
When the system drifts too far from its ethical moorings.
The people with the strongest internal compass, the ones most committed to the original ideals, ironically become the most likely to clash with the leadership, and thus the most likely to be branded as enemies of the system. They embody the failure this system wants to deny.
So it's a cautionary tale that goes way beyond Alcatraz and VX gas. It's about how institutions react when challenged from within on moral grounds.
It really is. It's about the mechanisms of denial and survival within large organizations and the potential cost paid by individuals who try to hold them accountable. The system, Lake implies, often finds it easier to sacrifice a person's honor than to confront its own failings.
Wow. Okay, so let's try to pull this all together as we wrap up. We've gone through Lake's analysis of the betrayal, the psychology, the ethical insurgency model, the paradox, the scapegoating. What's the final takeaway from Lake's paper?
The core conclusion, the big reframing, is that we should reconsider Hummel, not as a clear-cut villain or traitor, but as something far more complex. Lake essentially argues Hummel was, in a deeply tragic and flawed way, the last loyalist.
The last loyalist. How so?
Because his rebellion wasn't against America's ideals. It was against the version of America, the specific institutional practices that he felt had betrayed those ideals, particularly the ideal of honoring military sacrifice. He was fighting, in his own destructive way, for the code the institution claimed to uphold but failed to practice.
So his extreme act of defiance was actually a final, twisted form of fidelity.
That's the provocative synthesis Lake offers. While loyalty usually means obedience, Lake suggests that when a system becomes fundamentally corrupt or betrays its core moral contract, then true fidelity to the ideals the system is supposed to represent, might actually demand rebellion against the compromised structure.
The rebellion becomes the final form of fidelity.
It's a challenging idea. Lake argues Hummel was trying to force the institution back towards its own proclaimed values, trying to save its soul, even if the method threatened its physical safety.
It forces you, as the audience or the reader of Lake's paper, to look past the surface actions, the rockets, the threats, and really grapple with the underlying ethical injury and the systemic failure that Lake argues propelled him. Was it madness or a desperate response to betrayal?
And that question, that framework, is useful beyond fiction. When we see extreme actions by individuals claiming moral justification, Lake's analysis pushes us to ask, what was the context? Was there systemic failure? What does the extremity of the response tell us about the initial problem?
Which leads perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener, drawing directly from Lake's conclusions about integrity and illusion.
If an institution, as Lake suggests can happen, reaches a point where maintaining its image, its moral illusion, requires it to actively condemn or criminalize acts of integrity, acts of loyalty to a higher moral code rather than just rules,
Then where does true loyalty actually reside for someone ethical within that system? Is it loyalty to the flawed institution or loyalty to the principles it has abandoned?
and what's the broader cost? Not just to the individual dissenter who might be scapegoated, but to the long-term health and legitimacy of the institution, and maybe even the society it serves, when it chooses to protect that illusion of moral perfection instead of confronting the difficult truths that dissenters, however flawed, might reveal.
A really challenging question to ponder. Does protecting the facade ultimately cause more damage than facing the rot?
It's something that resonates far beyond this one fictional case.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a truly unexpected analysis. We hope it gives you a new perspective on narrative, ethics, and maybe even real-world conflicts. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.